Our next speaker, Travis Walton, truly needs no introduction in the field of ufology. But to give a little bit of background to his story and to his experience, and to shed a little bit of light on what he will be talking about, we're going to play a short video for you all to watch, and then we will welcome to the stage Travis Walton.
Is your name Gregory Thomas Hayes?
Yes.
Did you see an object hovering above the clearing?
Yes.
Was it saucer-shaped?
Sort of.
Did you see Travis Walton approach the object on foot?
Yeah, I did.
Did you personally dislike Travis Walton?
What kind of question is that?
Did you or any of your crew murder Travis Walton?
Absolutely not.
What did it look like?
It looked like a fire.
You expect me to believe that a flying saucer came down and took your friend away?
Why the heck aren't you speaking up for us? Why let this man talk to us like this?
They took him.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming. How many people have seen the movie? Most of you. So probably most everyone realizes that they changed things quite a bit. But I'm working on getting a remake of the movie with the hope to, tell it more the way it really happened. So toward that end, anybody that would like to write me a little email at my website, traviswalton.com, and say, in a short statement that they would like to see a remake, I'll put all these comments together with, hundreds that I've already received and bind them up together and take them to a producer and to emphasize the point that we'd like to have a more accurate telling. But there were things that were fictionalized and condensed and simplified in the movie, and to a certain extent that's understandable because it's a very visual medium, and even though in my book I go into all kinds of detail about exactly what happened, you can't have talking heads and you basically can't tell, you have to show. So they dramatize things that you would have to take a great deal of time to explain verbally, it's just a much better way to do it. For example, in the movie, there's a scene where the actor is held down with this membrane over his face and he's struggling to breathe through this. And although that didn't happen, it does a much better job of conveying to the audience the reason that I was experiencing so much panic. Because nothing will generate more panic in you than not being able to breathe. And so, other simplifications like I had two brothers, Don and Dwayne, that were combined into one character in the movie named Dan. It's not accurate, it's not documentary, and it's not really intended to be. So those kinds of things are, acceptable. And in a future movie, there might be those sorts of things going on. But basically what I'm really pushing for is to kind of pass on to people the kind of evolving awareness that I've had about what it really all meant in my own personal opinion and analysis. Right after it happened, I was so traumatized that, I was, only too willing to accept Hollywood's take on it as being, kind of a horrific, very negative experience, which it was. But in hindsight, perhaps not deliberately on their part. Anyway, it was just an ordinary work day, and I'm advancing this here, and it's not advancing. So anyway, if we could advance the slides, it's not working. I can do without them if it's not going to work. We've been putting in some long days. We were trying to finish up the contract before the winter weather shut us out, and there we go. And so we worked till almost dark, and a lot of people aren't aware that in Arizona we got quite a bit of forest, the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world. And so, we drove, maybe half an hour east or west from Snowflake to Heber, and then up into the mountains near the rim for the job. One of the highest points in Arizona, a lot of forest. You can, see San Francisco peaks, which clear over 100 miles from there. So the crew comprised of Michael Rogers, the crew boss, he was in the upper left there, Ken Peterson with the glasses, and Alan Dallas, the black sheep of the family. Lower left was Dwayne Smith. Couldn't get a hold of him, so he wasn't really included in the cast. As you might have noticed in the movie, there was only 6 in the crew. There was actually 7 of us. John Gillette in the center at the bottom there, and then Steve Pierce, the youngest guy on the crew. He was played by Henry Thomas, the little boy from the wee E.T., grown up, and that's me back then. And we all fit into a crew cab truck, a double cab truck, so 3 in the front, 4 in the back. We finished the day's work, we loaded up our equipment in the back, and we're headed out of there. In the movie, it gives the impression that we'd been driving for some time and we're getting drowsy, like it was a long drive. It was a long drive, but we hadn't gone very far before we noticed these glimmers of light. So everybody was still in a very alert state from having been working hard physically just moments before. And we saw these little glimmers of light. And of course, out in the woods, it's a very remote area. That's something out of the ordinary, but not at first real alarming. It was just kind of a curiosity at first, and then, the more it wasn't adding up. We were driving south up towards the rim, which is, the higher point, which is also, the rim road also borders the Apache reservation there. And the road was paralleling the back of this ridge, but it was kind of down off of the left side of the ridge. So the peak of the ridge was to our right, and as we were driving along, these little glimmers of light, I at first thought it was probably deer hunters. But then I realized that the source of the light was coming from higher than where the crest of the ridge would have been, in other words, above ground level. So that didn't add up. And, it wasn't like the whole crew immediately spotted the light. It was just all these little conversations among the groups of people paired off talking, suddenly started, dropping out of sight real quickly, and so everybody was looking in the same direction. At first I was thinking the hunters, and then I thought, well, maybe there's a lightning strike, because the forest in that area has the highest number of lightning strikes of any place in the continental United States other than the Everglades. So we have quite a few hits, and we've even encountered that on the way to work before, where the trees are sitting there burning because it was recently hit by lightning. But it'd been clear, dry weather. We didn't have any stormy weather that would explain that. So I thought, well, perhaps a plane crashed. And I found out later one of the other crew members was kind of thinking the same thought. But this little mental inner deliberation didn't go on too long, because I could see a break in the trees up ahead where the light was sort of shining across the road. There was pretty thick growth at the time. And I said, Mike, hurry up, get up there where we can see, So we got up there, and as soon as we got into where this light was shining across, we looked to our right, and there it was, hovering in plain sight. No mistaking this for the planet Jupiter, like our debunker there. That was one of his first theories, Unmistakable. Alan yelled out, "It's a flying saucer!" Because it was self-evident. Everybody knew what we were looking at. This was not some ball of light in the distance, and it wasn't so bright that we couldn't see the structure. It was incredible, the sight. John was saying here, he spoke with me recently, he was one of the crew members sitting in the back there. He was saying that to him it was like some fantastic sports car. It was smooth as glass. It was metallic in parts of it, and parts of it were glowing, but not so brightly you couldn't see the whole thing. And I had the impression that it was just going to be gone real quickly, and that was what I was thinking when I threw open the door and started towards it. Alan Dallas was said in an interview way back that it looked to him like I was being controlled, like I was in some kind of trance. And Steve says the same thing, but as far as my own perceptions are concerned, to me, I felt like I wasn't completely under my own control. I was just really curious and thinking that, the closer I could get to it before it got away, the more I might learn, just to see it up close. There was a little bit of me kind of showing off for the crew, but, mainly I was just awestruck, looking up at this thing. It just had the most awe-inspiring, the power of it, The crew said that they could feel the vibration in the truck, but the closer I got, the more scared I became and the more agitated the crew became, and they started yelling at me to get back in the truck. But I came to a point where there was a pile of logging debris, and I couldn't really get that much closer. So I was looking up at it at about like a 45-degree angle. And I stopped just short of the pile, and they were really screaming and swearing at me to get back in the truck. And so, I turned to look at them, and it suddenly got louder, and it started to move and rise up. And I was startled by that, so I jumped for cover. And the closest thing was this pile of logging debris. I got down behind a log that was sticking out there. I was in a crouch there, and I was thinking, I'm going to jump up and sprint back to the truck. And they were really, getting pretty intense with saying, "Let's go, get out of there." And so I didn't really need to be told. I was thinking right then that I'd got myself in a real fix here, and I was kind of torn between staying hidden behind the log and just getting back in the truck and getting away from there. But I decided to sprint back, and when I raised up, as soon as I stood fully up, I just felt this numbing shock go through me. Dwayne Smith, one of the guys on the crew, he later became an electrician. To him, he said it sounded like electricity. But in the police file, one of the men was quoted in the report as saying that it looked like a long blue flame, and the others described it as looking like a beam. But it was extremely powerful, they said, and they said the most incredibly bright thing they'd seen in their life. It lit up the night brighter than day, and they said it was like I stepped on a landmine. Like it just threw me back through the air, and they were talking amongst themselves. They said about how screaming back and forth. It killed him. He's dead. Because the way my body went flying through the air. I initially described it as being like 10 feet, but Steve come back around here recently, the youngest guy on the crew, and he's insisting no, it was more like 20 feet. But however it was, my body flew through the air, and the way I landed limp and wasn't protecting myself from the fall, that they just assumed, they just knew I was dead. He's dead. It killed him, just like they said in the movie. So it's entirely understandable that they would take off like that, Steve, he's always reluctant to admit that he was scared, or, he's trying to say that Mike took off and he wasn't one of the ones yelling, "Get us out of here." But, I'll go with the description of the majority that everybody screamed, "Get us out of here," And of course, Mike was responsible for the safety of the whole crew. They just seen somebody get killed. So I don't find fault with them that they didn't risk their own lives to save a dead body, So they took off and they nearly wrecked the truck, driving through the woods, just running over trees and whatnot. And they described, being fearful that they were being chased and in a real panic. And they finally, once they couldn't see the craft behind them anymore, and I wasn't following them, they jumped out and were yelling at each other about what to do. And they saw some deer hunters just, they were almost to the rim road. And they saw them passing by, and they had this idea, well, it's not safe to go back. We're unarmed, but, we could get some guns from these hunters. And because they already realized at that point they were going to have to go back. But so they went and tried to catch the deer hunters, and then they couldn't do it. But see, when Mike pulled over and he said, "All right, we got to go back and see if we can rescue him. Some of the guys said, no way, we're not going back there. Let's just go in, get some help, and but the older guys, Ken and Mike, said, no, we got to see if we can help him. I mean, what if we're too late by going back to town first? So when Mike said, okay, the truck's going back, and anybody who really doesn't want to go can wait here, nobody volunteered to stand alone outside the truck. Of course not. But in the movie, they had everybody getting out but Mike, so they could preserve the murder mystery. What really happened when he went back? But they all went back. And I give those guys credit for that. That took a lot of courage, They were trying to do a rescue. There was no other reason to go back. It certainly wasn't curiosity. So they went back, and this is what the craft looked like, when I was up under it, looking upward. And the glow of it just, made a really strange look around. The light had just a weird sort of effect. But one comment they made later was that it seemed like something's about to happen. And I'm thinking now that there may have been a reason for that, not just, the dangerousness of what I was doing, but they may have been sensing the buildup of some kind of an electrical or energy charge. Because I'm thinking that when I stood up, at that point, my head and chest were closest to the craft that they were at any other point. Plus, the increase in sound and the volume and the motion, suggests to me that it was getting ready to take off. And that extra energy output built up some kind of a field. So it wasn't like they were somehow inducing me to come close and then zap me and take me that way. I'm thinking more now, if there's a remake, I would like to, add the perspective that, I'm the one that caused this. I'm the one that took this reckless step of approaching this thing. And then when I closed the distance, this energy jumped through me to the ground and caused severe harm. I may have been, in a near-death situation. And so that's the new perspective I would like to take with the movie, that if there is a remake someday, that it was actually, like I've accepted the term abduction, because, that's what people call these things, but it's more like an ambulance call, more of a rescue mission, really. I made something bad happen, and they were in a position to make it right. If they'd left me laying there, perhaps in cardiac arrest, the best case scenario for the crew would be to pick me up and take me to Payson Hospital or the Shola Hospital, which would have been over an hour and way too late. If a person's in cardiac arrest, you've got 4 to 6 minutes before brain death begins. And so that's probably the reason I'm thinking now that I was returned, taken. And the fact that I was returned at all, again, suggests, a less than malevolent motive on their part. I wasn't just dropped back in the woods where it happened, which I would have froze to death before I could get help. I was put back near town where I could get help. And Heber is not where I live, but it was the town nearest where it happened. And also, Heber is down in a canyon, a deep canyon, and there's some steep-sided rock walls out of there. So they were able to descend and deposit me on the edge of town where I could see, to go where to go to get help, and yet they would not be visible from a distance at all. Whereas if I had been taken to Snowflake, which is in a big wide valley, if they had lowered and come down there, they would have been seen by hundreds of people. So that explains that to me. But the fact that I was returned whole and healthy, all of these things combined to make me think that. And this is, years of puzzling over what happened and why. And, I've only got myself to blame. But, but I digress. The movie, really missed an opportunity. You know how Hollywood loves special effects. When they showed the beam coming on, it looks more like of a spotlight, and it just sort of picks the actor up and tosses him back. But what the crew described was much more violent than that. A great opportunity for some special effects to, when the more accurate version is ever made. And so the crew proceeded into town. They called the law enforcement. And when the sheriff and his men interviewed the men, they could tell something really terrible had happened. you know. When the crew had gone back to see if they could rescue me, they were unable to find me. They did see the craft leaving, and they described all this to the sheriff. You know, at one point, Mike, you know, fell to his knees and was crying, and he's not ashamed to admit that. You know, I'm not ashamed to admit how totally terrified I was, and Steve Pierce was still crying when they made it to the sheriff. So the sheriff and his men knew that something really terrible had happened, but they immediately became suspicious that there had been a fight and that I had been murdered, and so that they had just made up this cover story and to explain for why I wasn't ever going to be seen again. But Steve has always been very, very upset that I reported that he was still crying when they went to the sheriff. And he was only 17, you know, and it's no reflection on him or how tough he is or anything, but he's really had issues with that. He's, you know, to the point of denying that it happened. Right after my first book came out, he came over to my house, he wanted to fight about it, and so to this day, he tries to minimize how frightened he was. He denies that, you know, he was yelling for the boss to take off, and now he's trying to deny that he was crying, but I'll take the sheriff's men's word for it, and the rest of the crew, that, you know, they were in a very traumatized state. But the sheriff and his men suspected him of murder, and this pressure on the men continued throughout the search. Now, in the movie, they didn't go back that night, but in reality, half the crew did go back with the sheriff and his men. And so that, again, I give those guys credit for doing that, because, you know, they didn't know what they were up against and what they might run into. And, you know, the fact that the sheriff's men were armed was not that much help, you know. This was a very powerful thing. And so they went back and were unable to find anything that night, but there was a massive manhunt. You know, the sheriff organized a search, over 50 men on horseback, on foot, four-wheel drives. They had airplanes crisscrossing the area, helicopters, tracking dogs. You know, it was pretty extensive, and they were unable to find anything. The tracking dogs were unable to find any scent outside the clearing. You know, it just went from the edge of the road where I got out of the truck up to, you know, where I fell. And so, you know, some of the horses, they said, had behaved very strangely and bolted. So there was a lot of pressure in the community to try to explain it away. And so, you know, I think a lot of the locals were only too eager to believe that, yeah, well, this is murder or something else, you know, some kind of hallucination. So a lot of those stories were floating around, and the men were dealing with a lot of skepticism and the constant accusation that they had killed me. During the search, John Gillette was saying that the sheriff sent a deputy with each of the crewmen who just continually pushed at him all day. Come on, tell us what really happened. Who did this? You know, they were kind of pointing the finger at Alan Dallas. He was the black sheep of the crew. Had had trouble with the law in the past, and so, you know, they were thinking that, you know, and I'd also had, you know, kind of a little mock fight with Alan. You know, I mean, we'd had a little dispute, and you know, but, you know, Alan was kind of a hothead. He'd come to blows with probably everybody on the crew, or nearly so, you know, and so he was kind of the prime suspect. And so when the sheriff brought in the state police lie detector expert, Alan was the one that was graded as inconclusive. But I got a hold of one of the reports from the police file years later, and in it said that Alan had basically told the truth. Now, with a polygraph test, you don't just go through the questions one time. They go through the exact same questions in the same order 3 or 4 times, so that if there's any kind of a reaction in there somewhere, they can exclude that as being some sort of a random thought passing through your head or something like that. If they get the same kind of intense reaction on all 3 or 4 points, that is significant that you're reacting to that one question. Well, he only went through the questions twice before he got in an argument with the examiner and cussed him out and stomped out. So that was the reason he was given an inconclusive, but why the police were basically given the conclusion privately that he'd told the truth. But all that was resolved by Alan being retested by the same examiner years later with better equipment, more modern methods, and the examiner, of course, having much more experience, and Alan and Mike passed again with flying colors, and I took a test from him. You know, at the time that the crew passed the lie detector test, the president of the American Polygraph Association said that the odds were over 1,000,000 to 1 that there could be that many tests on a single issue and there being any kind of an error. Because, you know, everybody knows polygraphs isn't 100%, but when you have that many people, 6 people on a single issue, the odds were 1,000,000 to 1. Well, now there's over 16 tests passed in connection with this incident. So I don't know what the calculation on the odds of a mistake being, but I've passed 5 different tests from 3 different examiners, and the last one being just a couple of years ago, the last 2. But in the aftermath, even after the polygraph test, they just switched to other sorts of attacks, but I'll get to that as we go along here. After I was hit, I regained consciousness pretty slowly. I was in and out for a while, and I didn't know where I was at first. I was disoriented, in a lot of pain, and I didn't know where I was. I thought, and then I remembered approaching the object, and I thought, well, the crew probably, I was hurt, and they took me in to get medical attention. I thought I was in some kind of a hospital. I was on some kind of an operating table or raised gurney. There was a light above me, and but because of the pain and the difficulty in breathing that I was having, I didn't want to move too much. I had this thing over my chest, and I didn't want to make it worse, and it did hurt more to move. So I was trying to hold still, but I could hear the sounds of movement around me, and my vision was really blurry, and it was even double vision for a while. But I came to, got a little more clear as time went on. Like I said, in and out of consciousness. It's kind of like the pain itself would knock me out, but also the struggling to breathe. And one dispute that I got in with our chief debunker was he made this $1,000 bet that I had said I had been bleeding heavily, although there was no evidence of blood on my clothing. I said I was breathing heavily. And so he didn't pay off on the $1,000 bet like he did Stan Friedman. He made a bet and had to pay up. But anyway, that was the key source of my panic, is not being able to breathe, because when I could finally focus my eyes and I saw these creatures standing over me, I knew I was in no hospital. And so I just was instantly totally hysterical. And of course this shot of adrenaline just gave me extra strength, and I rolled away from them, and this device that they had across my chest fell off, and I staggered back, and they were like coming around towards me immediately, which added to the panic. It's dimly lit, I'm struggling to breathe, it's claustrophobic, low ceiling, very small, and I staggered back and I bumped up against a shelf, a little bench there, and I turned to look, and there was these instruments scattered out there, and so I just grabbed the biggest thing and started flailing at them, and so they stopped, suddenly turned, and I'm gonna move along kind of quickly here because we're running short of time. Okay, thank you. And so I went looking for a way out, and came to a room where there was some apparently doors, which I tried to open, operating some controls on the chair there. And that's when this human-looking being came in and led me out of there, and which I at first mistook to be just some kind of a rescue, where they were taking me out of this craft to another part of this larger building or larger craft, to where, I thought I was finally away from these creatures. But then, they wouldn't answer me, and so I really started to resist, and they put me down on this table, and I started to really fight. My panic gave me a little strength. I was able to pull one hand free and get it under the edge of this mask they put over my face, but I wasn't fast enough, and I lost consciousness. And next thing I know, I woke up outside of the town nearest where this happened. I recognized where I was, made my way down to the telephones there, and called my family. And so like I said, there was just an onslaught of questions and accusations after I was returned. I was dealing with an incredibly difficult experience, trying to handle this, and the memories of what happened, my nightmares at night, and then all this stuff in the media was just secondary to me, but still, very disconcerting. There was no place back then. There was very little to turn to, and so there was just all kinds of things. Well, he was hallucinating on drugs. Well, I had medical tests, showed blood and urine samples, no trace of any drug in my body. This was Maricopa County Medical Examiner's drug screen, and I had a whole battery of tests: EKG, EEG, hypnosis. Whole variety of things, and I document in great detail in my book the the research that went on and this whole litany of accusations that the debunkers came forward with just blew them out of the water. And now the final coup de grace for our debunker Philip Klass was getting a hold of the Freedom of Information FBI file on him, which has some documents in it. One memo in particular from the director of the FBI at the time was J. Edgar Hoover, concerning Philip Klass to the director of the CIA. And the decision in the file was to retain it in RUC status, remains under consideration, which is a common way for the CIA to recruit their little propagandists or helpers around the world, is to get something on them for leverage. So they had the opportunity to prosecute him for revealing classified information in connection with his job at the magazine Aviation Week in Space Technology, and use that as leverage to get him to do their bidding. You know, they can steer him, but you know, he already had the motivation. It was his own hobby to start with. He was just not on very good terms with the FBI at all. They thought very poorly of him. I've got documents. They're describing their opinion of him as not being of sound mind and how they needed to be careful with future dealings with him. But, you know, so much of the proof and evidence that has come out over the years, you know, meticulously, like I said, documented that in here, because for the record, you know, I have not been shy about going to every single accusation they made and detailing how it was, you know, totally not feasible or disproven in a variety of ways. Being able to show original documents where Philip Klass made a quotation where he actually eliminated the middle of a sentence in order to reverse the meaning of it. Just all kinds of really treacherous and duplicitous sorts of techniques. But Steve Pierce came around recently, and he details how, you know, Phil Klass tried to bribe him, offered him $10,000 to deny the experience. And so for all those people who have gone online or called Steve Pierce up and tried to refute him, you know, the law enforcement officer that took the message to Steve, you know, backs it up, and there's all kinds of proof, including a tape recording of the bribe offer. So I'm going to open it up for questions. I really ran short of time here, but so let me just make a few comments on a few of the illustrations here. These phone booths that I went to that night to call for help are still there, even though they're no longer functioning, and they're the only phone booths left in the entire area. The phone company listened in on the phone call, so they knew that that was authentic, and therefore they became kind of a landmark there. It's still there in Heber, next to the Heber Tire Shop, which used to be next door to the to a service station, which is now a restaurant. But there's my brother who stood by me and helped me through those terrible days right after I was returned, and he passed away 2 years ago. Well, a year and a half ago, and I really miss him. He really saved my life, actually. The Era Phenomena Research Organization sponsored the investigation, the medical test. Dr. Harder here did the hypnosis. Leo Sprinkle reviewed the psychiatric exams that proved that there was no transitory psychosis. I was interviewed by Dr. Jalen Hynek, and he made a press conference the next day that you know, I was not hoaxing and had been falsely accused. And my nightmares, you know, stayed with me for a long time afterwards, and it was those eyes boring into me that were so difficult to deal with. And I'm thinking that it was because when they all came around there and we had that little standoff there where they were facing me, the three of them, I think, were trying to reassert control, and it wasn't working. And I think the reason it wasn't working is because when I was hit by the beam, that it caused a neurological disturbance that that prevented them from controlling me, even acting in unison, the three of them. And what supports that is the EEG, the brainwave scan that I had done, was done by a technician who did not know what had happened to me. All he knew that he was looking for some sign of injury. And there was a kind of an unusual pattern there that I'm going to look into as far as how that would be interpreted today and if that pattern still exists. But there's some things I'm not going to get to. We talked about the accelerated growth in the past of the trees right near where the craft came down. And in this recent fiasco of a documentary that National Geographic did, we were supposed to look into that further, and there was some really good evidence gathered at that time that they just basically didn't use because they were too busy being silly. So we actually uncovered some new stuff there that I'll have to update in the future. But amazing stuff. And here's a copy of the memo on FBI memos, and interesting stuff, you know. But I'm going to go ahead and take questions. Okay.
Superb summary of the details. I have one question. I thought I remembered something about your growth of beard after you came down. Could you refresh my memory on that?
Well, when I very first saw my brother, I was under the impression that this was still the same night, you know. And as soon as my brother realized that, he said, "Travis, feel your face. You've been gone for 5 days," which was quite a shock. But, you know, I had a 5-day growth of beard. So a lot of people were trying to explain that I could only recall such a short period because they thought there was some kind of speed of light time contraction sort of thing. But the fact that the date on my watch had changed and that I had a 5-day growth of beard kind of undermines that idea. And now, you know, after finding out a little bit more about what Dr. Harder said after the hypnosis, there were other memories that have been blocked from me during the other 5 days.
It's nice to see you. My question was about the trees and what evidence you could give us or what you found about the abnormal samples in the trees around the UFO.
Well, you know, when National Geographic came there, I'm going to try to reverse these slides back to where we were. I was hopeful, you know, and they brought you know, someone there that was supposed to take these samples and go to the lab and all that. None of that, all that. They just that was an exercise in futility. But what we found was a stump there. The logging. See, we were the purpose that we were doing that day was cleaning up the previous logging contract on that Turkey Springs area. So the only tree stumps there are trees that were cut the previous year. And what this stump that we found out there with National Geographic, this was all filmed but not used, was a tree that was 200 years old and gave a benchmark for the kind of stability of growth rates for 200 years. And there was minimal variation in those growth rings. So, you know, for the skeptics that wanted to say the reason there was accelerated growth and we had this rapid growth, it was just some kind of a weather fluke or something, that's not borne out by this tree ring thing that shows this stable growth pattern on that ridge top at that exact location, which proves that these accelerated growth, 36 times the previous growth, fiber growth, was something quite anomalous. So.
Cool. Well, good luck to you. I hope you get to do the movie again.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we did go back to the start there. All right, go ahead. What was your question?
When you were returned to Earth, so to speak, were you fully clothed? I seem to remember in the movie you were naked.
Well, that was just Hollywood for you, you know. They always got to get the nude scene in, and I was fully clothed. I was still wearing the clothes that I was taken in, and those clothes were bagged up for forensic analysis, but in all the hubbub, they got thrown into a trunk and things thrown on top of them. So that evidence was kind of not pursued at the time like it should have been. Like today, we would be able to do DNA analysis on the clothes and find out if there was any foreign DNA or whatever. But I was clothed. There was a scene that was filmed where I'm naked and I come upon this couple in a car and they're naked and they start screaming, and you know, the crew said it was horrible. So it wasn't used, and it's a good thing.
And did they indeed do a physical examination on you?
I was taken to a doctor and given a thorough examination.
Excuse me, I mean the creatures.
Oh, well, you know, I regained consciousness in the middle of whatever was going on. There was all these instruments out there. You know, a lot of people call this a medical exam. But in light of my more recent interpretation that they were trying to revive me, I would go more along the lines that they were trying to repair the damage that had happened to me when the beam hit, rather than, you know, tinkering with me like dissecting a frog or something. You know?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Have other wonderful talk, yeah, really great. I was totally impressed by this. One of the questions I have is: has anyone else in your family had unusual experiences, and have you had other either subsequent or prior experiences?
Well, you know, as common as this phenomenon is, it's not surprising that my brother had a sighting 8 or 10 years before, a daylight sighting. So, you know, it's not that unusual. They say, well, 1 in 7 people. That's what it was back then. I think National Geographic did a survey recently where the percentage of people that have had a sighting is really far higher than that. So, you know, the idea that you'd have close friends or relatives who also had sightings is going to be more the norm than some kind of... See, back in the day, people would say, well, that's a suspicious coincidence. You know, if you've had more than one sighting, you know, you're called a repeater in those days, and that was not credible. But now it's turned around the other way to where people wonder why I haven't had more. But anyway.
How about other like paranormal or psychic experiences in the family? Or?
Well, you know, I'd rather not get into that. You know?
I'm sorry?
I said I'd rather not get into that.
Okay.
There's
that probably answers part of my question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Travis. Do you recall when you were on board the craft itself, were there several different types of creatures or entities?
Yeah,
and was there any type of...
there were these alien-like creatures that you saw.
So some humanoid type?
Yeah. Well, see, humanoid means 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, and that kind of thing, a humanoid. But human-looking would be these other beings that, you know, I at first took to be humans who were there to rescue me, but were probably, you know, very similar-looking beings. Some people call them Nordics, but, you know, there was some differences in them that weren't quite right, something a little odd.
Do you recall any type of communication between you?
It was one-way communication, me screaming like a maniac and them not answering anything.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's going to be the last one, Travis.
Hi there, Travis. I've seen the beings that you've encountered, like, predicted a couple different ways, you know, shown a couple different ways. I was wondering if you were familiar with the Lloyd Pye Star Child skull, and if this has any...
I've heard about that, and you know what? I've been remarking recently that there's been a pronounced tendency for investigators to lump all the creatures that have large eyes, bald heads, smaller creatures, whatever, into one category they call the grays. And I think that, you know, rather than explaining the variations in descriptions as being, you know, witness error or something like that, I think that people are just jumping to the conclusion that these are all the same race from a single place. I think it's more likely that they're lumping into one category creatures that probably came from entirely different planets and that aren't related in any way. And, you know, in support of that, you know, we have on this planet animals that look very similar that are not related at all. You know, you have a sugar glider in Australia, which is actually a marsupial, and we have a flying squirrel in this country, and totally evolved along totally separate lines, except in a similar environment.
Your pictures that you had up on the screen were pretty much the, you know, gray aliens that you see. Is that what you saw?
You know, that term didn't exist back then, and one major difference was they had eyes that blinked, you know, which is also something that Betty Hill and some others have reported. But then, you know, these black obsidian-like eyes, you know, people just call them all grays, you know, like there's just these few basic types. And I think probably it's just our own obliviousness to subtle differences and distinctions that actually exist. And so, you know, even the term alien agenda is a misnomer. I would say alien agendas in the plural. Same thing with government agenda, you know. They probably have a number of purposes and a number of reasons that they would try to suppress this or deny it. And that was our last question, and I'm going to go back to my table in here and I can answer some more questions in there. I thank you all for coming and for listening. I appreciate it.
What the fuck?
Our next speaker, Travis Walton, truly needs no introduction in the field of ufology. But to give a little bit of background to his story and to his experience, and to shed a little bit of light on what he will be talking about, we're going to play a short video for you all to watch, and then we will welcome to the stage Travis Walton.
Is your name Gregory Thomas Hayes?
Yes.
Did you see an object hovering above the clearing?
Yes.
Was it saucer-shaped?
Sort of.
Did you see Travis Walton approach the object on foot?
Yeah. Yeah, I did.
Did you personally dislike Travis Walton?
And what kind of question is that?
Did you or any of your crew murder Travis Walton?
Absolutely not.
What did it look like?
It looked like a fire.
You expect me to believe that a flying saucer came down and took your friend away?
Why the heck aren't you speaking up for us? Why let this man talk to us like this?
They took him.
Well, thank you. Thanks for coming. How many people have seen the movie? Most of you. So probably most everyone realizes that they changed things quite a bit. But I'm working on getting the remake of the movie with the hope to, tell it more the way it really happened. So toward that end, anybody that would like to write me a little email at my website, traviswalton.com, and say, in a short statement that they would like to see a remake, I'll put all these comments together with, hundreds that I've already received and bind them up together and take them to a producer and to emphasize the point that we'd like to have a more accurate telling. But there were things that were fictionalized and condensed and simplified in the movie, and to a certain extent that's understandable because it's a very visual medium, and even though in my book I go into all kinds of detail about exactly what happened, you can't have talking heads and you basically can't tell, you have to show. So they dramatize things that you would have to take a great deal of time to explain verbally, it's just a much better way to do it. For example, in the movie, there's a scene where the actor is held down with this membrane over his face, and he's struggling to breathe through this. And although that didn't happen, it does a much better job of conveying to the audience the reason that I was experiencing so much panic. Because nothing will generate more panic in you than not being able to breathe. And so, other simplifications like I had two brothers, Don and Dwayne, that were combined into one character in the movie named Dan. It's not accurate, it's not documentary, and it's not really intended to be. So those kinds of things are, acceptable. And in a future movie, there might be those sorts of things going on. But basically what I'm really pushing for is to kind of pass on to people the kind of evolving awareness that I've had about what it really all meant in my own personal opinion and analysis. Right after it happened, I was so traumatized that, I was, only too willing to accept Hollywood's take on it as being, kind of a horrific, very negative experience, which it was. But in hindsight, perhaps not deliberately on their part. Anyway, it was just an ordinary work day. And I'm advancing this here, and it's not advancing. So anyway, if we could advance the slides, it's not working. I can do without them if it's not going to work. We'd been putting in some long days. We were trying to finish up the contract before the winter weather shut us out. And there we go. And so we worked till almost dark, and a lot of people aren't aware that in Arizona we got quite a bit of forest, the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world. And so, we drove, maybe half an hour east or west from Snowflake to Heber, and then up into the mountains near the rim for the job. One of the highest points in Arizona, a lot of forest. You could, see San Francisco peaks, which clear over 100 miles from there. So the crew comprised of Michael Rogers, the crew boss. He was in the upper left there.